What's up, y'all? It's your boy Killer B, Doggone Witchfinder Journal. You got a witch, you know what I do to them. We got a great video for y'all today. Bovida, Spiritismo, and Secretism in the New World, especially specifically in Cuba. So I'll be right back with you guys right after this song. Secretism in the New World, especially thanks for y'all specifically in Cuba. So I'll be right back with you. As you just heard me just said again. So yeah, I'll be right back.
Si la luz redentora te llama y te llama con amor a la tierra, yo quisiera ver a ese ser cantándole gloria al divino Manuel. Oye, buen ser, avanza y ven, que el coro te llama y te dice ven. Oye, buen ser, avanza y ven, que el coro te llama y te dice ven. Si la luz redentora te llama y te llama con amor a la tierra, yo quisiera ver a ese ser cantándole gloria al divino Manuel. Oye, buen ser, avanza y ve, el coro te llama y te dice ven. Oye, buen ser, avanza y ve, el coro te llama y te dice ven. Jure Dios, Sandy.
Dios.
¿Somos o no somos?
Somos.
Santo Tomás.
Ven para creer.
Tres personas distintas y un solo Dios.
Verdadero.
Padre nuestro que estás en los cielos. Erisi balande. Erisi balande. Congo duwe. Congo duwe. Ay kuriangangule. Ay kuriangangule. Erisa mío.
Erisi balande. Erisi balande. Congo duwe. Congo duwe. Ay kuriangangule. Ay kuriangangule.
Oh, ya, 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 ya. Oh, ya, ya, pues venganza. Por una fin del todo va a ser. Guanaluta con Guasimento. Oh, ya, ya. Oh, ya, ya. Oh, ya, ya. Adiós, María Reina.
Hey, what's up, y'all? I see y'all up in here.
Oh, vení, protectorio, vení. Ser espías te dio la misión. Oh, venir, protectorio a la tierra. A ver qué linda coronación.
Oh, vení, protectorio, vení. El día de nuestra misión. Oh,
el Santísimo, sea el Santísimo, Madre mía de la caridad, ayúdanos, amparanos, en el nombre de Dios, ay Dios.
En el nombre de Dios.
Thanks. How y'all doing today? What's up, Nikki?
Hey, how you doing, Killer?
Chilling. I was knocked out. I wasn't sure if I was able to do a video tonight or not, but I was like, hey, you know what? Let me just do it.
And that's
so,
awesome.
I was gonna do this last night.
That's pretty cool. This is a subject I do enjoy very much.
Switch it up.
So,
I got the
yeah.
So I'm gonna do some reading tonight. I'm glad I got you on, so we can talk about some of the stuff I read.
Oh yeah.
Just read it on through. Put my own self to sleep. So
Yeah, I've noticed that
this.
can be kind of hard to do by yourself. It's harder to talk when you don't have someone to talk to. So.
Yep. Absolutely. So I got this someone's thesis here by a guy named Lionel Brora Bologna called Bovidas Spiritualis, a theological study of Cuban family religions. We gets into it's pretty interesting. I've just been skimming through it last night. I was just going to be trying to find the parts and stuff that I wanted to read. It's basically like showing how a lot of the African culture, the indigenous people culture, and the European Christian culture, and how they all like came together and like they all adopted little things from each other, and how like how these different people, even though they were different in religion or different, even with the certain circumstances, with the slaves and stuff like that, they had to abide by certain things, and how the Europeans at some point actually gave them leeway and how they worship, even if they had to worship under their gods, but there was such a leeway where they actually let them do their own thing, long as basically they represented their deities, So like say like for example, they would have their whatever deity, the Mary or whatever they were using, that these indigenous and African people, they're allowed to practice what they practice. You know what I mean? But long as they just had this deity in front of them. And how like the Europeans after a while even adopted some of the things that they were doing into their religions and stuff. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is. So, I know what you mean, though. For example, there's a goddess of the sea called Yamaya, and I forget which saint is associated with her, but it's one that's associated with boats and sailors. So when you would see people doing a festival to that saint, you wouldn't know if they were Santeros worshiping Yamaya, or if they were actually venerating the saint in the Catholic tradition. So there was a bit of a mix there.
So I'm going to read a little bit on the Bovida and get into the history type of things that were going on and stuff like that. Point here that I wanted to start from. I think it's pretty long. I'm going to share it at the end, too. So I'm going to get the link for it so people can download the whole thing. Got Sister P up in here. Hey, P. So get this thing here ready. And you're going to be doing some cool videos and stuff on this type of stuff too.
Oh yeah,
so,
yeah.
You
for
let
sure.
people know your channel.
This is something that I find very interesting. So I'll be making videos on it almost as often as you will, but we'll see.
Yep. So this is my buddy Negi Springfield. So you guys, you see his name over there in the chat. You can search for him on YouTube and check out his channel. That's also a channel. He's gonna go over a lot of stuff too. Some things that we have shared in the years and stuff like that, and all type of fun stuff that we like to learn and like to read about. All right. I guess I could start. Let me start running a spot. Shit. Let's start. No, that's not where I want to start. This is not it either. Really? This thing's so long. Okay. I guess I'll start. It says, Bóvedas, Spiritualities, and Cuban Homes. So my interest in the subject of folk, family, religious practices date back to my early childhood. Often enough, my mother would briefly walk away from the family dining room, carrying with her a small portion of the best dish from the table, to return empty-handed a few minutes later. I soon learned that she was, in fact, taking the dinner portion to her Bóveda spiritual and placing it before the pictures of her mother and grandmother. Her simple ritual of food offerings was accompanied by some endearing and personal words. Myra Mami, Yo Sique, Titi Gusta Mucho Esto, Abula Nana, Esto es para ti. Excuse me if I'm not pronouncing that wrong.
If I could see it, I could
you feel
read it, but if I could see what you're reading, I could probably tell you if you're doing it right. But yeah, it's a mixture of Spanish and African words, so there's some leeway, but you pronounce it all like Spanish.
Okay. All right. See it now. Oh, gotta make it a little bigger. There it goes. Oh my God, that should be better. Let's see what it looks like. All right, that looks good. That's good. All right. For many children raised in Cuba within the last century, witnessing such type of ritual would have been a very common experience. Bóvedas and spiritualities have been and still remain inescapable presence in many Cuban homes. They have remained prevalent even after the Republican period of social stagnation, as well as cultural, political stigmatization of non-Orthodox Christian religious practices. Their predominance of Cuban families continue in the post-1959 period. Mysticism and ideological disparaging of much of the religious narrative and ritual they representing for communion with their ancestors. Bóveda spiritualities embody intimacy and prayer, home and memory, hope and future in the Cuban culture. This second chapter aims to describe Bóvedas and spiritualities specifically regarding their sources, syncretic process at work, and ethnographic foundations in the current practice of Cuban family religions. Firstly, I will provide a comprehensive ethnographic description of Bóveda's spirituality. Secondly, I will highlight the category of syncretism and emphasize its non-verificationist qualities, how it refers more in process of interpretation and enactment than to finished symbols, narrative, and practices, resulting from genealogical borrowing found in both Cuban folk religions and family religions. Thirdly, I will describe essential elements from the preceding religious systems which have influenced Cuban folk religion, specifically the practice of Cuban family religion. Ultimately, I will argue that Bóveda spirituals are emblematic forms of Cuban family religion. Hey, what's up, Marcus Lee? All right, P, if anybody get out of pocket, you know what to do. Definition and description. Field research supporting my observations about Bóveda's spiritualities dates back to my master in theology studies. As I researched home-based forms of religion practice concerned with ancestors, throughout the interviews informing that research, respondents consistently referred to their spiritual shrines as being central to their religious practice in the home, as well as a focal point for prayer and for communion with their ancestors. At that point, I was methodologically more concerned for establishing hermeneutical links between these forms of family religions and established forms of religious practice within the Episcopal Church of Cuba. And this verificationist approach is reflected on both the methodology employed and the results obtained after this research. Despite such methodological shortcomings, my research did reflect the prevalence of the practice of Bóveda's spiritualities among members in different parishes of the Episcopal Church of Cuba, who also sustain regular religious practices at home. It also describes some of the ritual strategies adopted by practitioners, as well as some of the spiritual body disciplines adopted by those keeping spiritual shrines. Because of the seemingly sufficiency of the two lines of analysis, at least for the goals established for this recent paper, my appeal to the result obtained out of the field research will be circumscribed by providing firstly a comprehensive description of spiritual shrines. Okay, I want to get down to the nitty-gritty. In the life of the home, Bóveda's spirituality served as domestic locus of religious, mythical, and biographical representation as tools of embodying the memory of the family ancestors and other mythical ancestral figures. In both their design and use, Bóveda's spiritualities are concerned with storing and displaying objects and artifacts of religious meaning and ritual usage, existently and experimentally relevant to those who own and care for each shrine. Bóveda's spiritualities are intimate physical enactments of religious interpretation and practice, and can be best accounted for when approached as religious practices for everyday life in the family home and domestic. The location of a Bóveda spiritual can vary and generally fall to the quietest and cleanest rooms of the house, with the exception of bedrooms. While the ideal practice is to dedicate the whole room to a Bóveda, the realities of the overall Cuban housing situation usually makes it that a Bóveda is instead kept in the corner of a quiet and clean room. The members of the family are expected to recognize and display care towards the Boveda by never touching or moving it, avoiding loud conversations in its vicinity, as well as refraining from eating, engaging in sexual or business-like activities. Okay.
Can I mention something real quick?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
It's interesting to note that the word Boveda means a vault or dome. So a Boveda spiritual would be a spiritual vault or dome, kind of bringing to mind heaven in most. So I just wanted to point that out.
Wow. Okay.
So it makes sense that that's where the ancestors would be kept.
That's deep. Huh. Okay. From a physical point of view, Boveda spiritual resembles a vertical, altar-like structure, usually divided into two or more shells, or planes of representation. Because of this shape, a Boveda might resemble a group of randomly placed glasses filled with water, known as cistercians. Pitchers, flowers, and other religious objects often found in any corner of just about any room in the house. Nevertheless, the disposition and concentration of objects in the Boveda symbolize the personal and emotional connection, which have been represented through the means of iconography, offerings, and prayer. In most cases, rest on a rectangular wooden table of various sizes, covered with a white cloth, usually understood to represent the different planes of existence of both mythical and hereditary ancestors. On this white cloth, there are placed usually 6 glasses filled with water, which are equally distributed on either side of the table, with one larger wine glass placed in the center, also filled with water. While each glass is meant to represent and honor a different supernatural entity, be it an Orisa, a mythical dead character, or deceased relatives or friends. It's like what you're just saying. The larger wine glass filled with water stands for essentially the God, Holy of Holies. There is usually a candle by the larger glass, which is lit whenever the practitioner interacts with the Boveda. Other elements, usually located in the balanced disposition on either side, include photographs of ancestors, Roman Catholic prayer cards, as well as one or more vases with flowers in white color whenever possible. Depending on the circumstances, there might be more personal items, from cigars, sunglasses, and rosaries, to a wristwatch. At the top of most Boveda spiritualities, a crucifix can be found, serving as a spiritual focus for the rest of the elements. In some cases, the crucifix is surrounded by smaller adornments with origins in folk Catholicism, as in the case of Passion Sunday palms, shaped into the symbol of religious movement. Boveda spirituals can also be described through the process of discursive or symbolic exchange, in which its practitioners engage borrowing fragments of preceding religious systems, as well as from other wider cultures. In what follows, I will first inform my appeal to the category of syncretism, to then provide a brief genealogy of these preceding religious systems, describing how they traveled and eventually found themselves embedded in the Cuban culture. The combined appeal to these two descriptions seek to further contextualize the historical background of Boveda spirituality in the Cuban religious panorama. So yeah, you're kind of right. Like you said, how the bowls or the glass and globes of water, and they were saying like how these, however it's set up, they each one represents a, I guess, like a deity or an ancestor or a mythological deity or something like that.
It's sort of interesting. It's sort of interesting how they pick water, because in a way, in some cultures, water is seen as like a barrier that allows things to come through, or a medium for things to come through.
Right.
So if you see it that way, I've seen something like this. It's kind of funny because this is how they do it in Hispanic Espiritismo, or Hispanic spiritualism. So, yeah, this is something I've heard of before.
There's a gentleman that I know, and he would teach me a little bit. I only see him like once in a while, and then I just like bombard him with questions for like the little bit of time that I'm around him and stuff and be out. So I try to gather as much information I can from him. He was telling me too, like with the Boveda, he would use like a candle. Like the candle, I guess you can use it like your shrine, like through the globe, like with the candle.
Yeah, because the flicker of the candle flame, what that does is it has a sort of hypnotic effect on your mind. So if you ever heard of Solomonic evocations, what they do is they use a mirror and they use candle light, and the flickering light does the same thing. It puts you in a hypnotic trance, so it makes you more receptive.
Wow. And there was also something about the bubbles. Like you read the bubbles. There was a way to read the bubbles, I guess, for know something, or I guess maybe divination or something like divination. I'm not.
Yeah, you look for patterns in the bubbles in the water, which that may or may not mean anything, but it's a random thing, which makes it good for divination when you have something random like that.
Yeah. Malak, I think Siberius is tied up tonight. Earlier. Based on Cuban government survey carried out throughout the past decade, there are more than 70 religious groups or denominations found in Cuba. Wow, Christian and otherwise. These are, of course, groups of traditions which have developed to a certain point of structural organization and social visibility. Such accounting, however, prevents the consideration of any local, less structurally developed or socially visible religious traditions, which can be found throughout the country. Grassroots of Cuban folk religion. This falls in line with most recurring description of Cuban folk religious practices as being predominantly diffused. An average practitioner of Cuban folk religions, while engaged in religious discourse and rituals, withdraw from preceding religious traditions, even non-religious elements in culture, would attach himself or herself to none. Rather, a typical practitioner would combine various elements from different traditions in search of what is religiously meaningful and locally sensible in his or own circumstances. That's deep right there. So basically, they're saying they would take from whatever worked for them. That's what I'm getting out of it. Right?
And that kind of means that the way it will appear in different people's practice is going to be different. It's not going to look the same.
Right.
So, to a degree, that is a good thing, and to a degree, that also means that people can kind of freestyle sometimes. So you end up having to be careful, if someone's going to pull the wool over your eyes that way.
Yeah. So these types of religious speech, ritual, and belief have been regularly referred to as secret, with relative success in conveying the complexity of the cultural process involved in each case. The term secretism is by all accounts first registered in Plutarch, Moralina, under a rather positive light. However, the term was eventually brought into embodying negative connotations as early as the 17th century. For example, during the syncretistic controversies to describe the upcoming theological chaos resulting from the proposed reunion of Reformed churches, such dismissive perceptions of syncretism were to remain in full force throughout the already ongoing colonist expansion into the New World, and to one or another degree extend into our present time, to eventually outgrow the theological debates of the 17th century, to go on to influence the field of anthropology as well. The genealogies of syncretism and alternative categories, Creole, melting pot, hybridization, have been frequently challenged by scholars from different angles and historical periods. I have chosen to refer to syncretism as a comprehensive category of process for cultural mixture, as is the least ideologically charged of all the available categories, and the most helpful operational terms for representing and speaking to these processes. In this thesis, I will be using the term in the original double meaning found in Greek, syncretismo, referring to dynamics of fusion and strategic alliance. These two processes describe the dialogical nature of practices undertaken by the folk religion practitioners as they combine dissimilar, one or another degree, elements from two or more religious traditions. In turn, these borrowing are enacted through visual representation, textual and symbolic narratives, and ritual performance. Syncretism, however, speaks more to the nature of cultural process rather than just to a moment in time. It points to changes pertaining discernment, engagement, and mixture, rather than just the materially ephemeral ritual evidences. No, ephemeral. You know what ephemeral means?
I didn't quite catch that. What did you say?
Ephemeral. It means lasting for a short time. Okay, all right.
Oh, okay. All right, cool.
Ritual evidences. Religious syncretism can be best seen as describing a double process for selecting those elements, which integrate the symbolic and discursive world of folk religions, from either established religious systems or family traditions, and shaping how these elements interact with and complement those already present. Syncretism refers to dynamics involved in the continual cultural process of reinterpretation by which old meanings are ascribed to new elements, thereby changing the cultural meaning of the old forms and updating them through the contemporary narrative and practice. I think I can skip ahead a little bit. Okay, yeah, this is a good one right here. In Cuban family religions and emblematically, so in Boveda spiritualists, there is evidence of at least three distinct autonomous religious traditions which have been subjected by practitioners to concrete, persistent processes of interpretation, mutual exchange, and reformulation. In this section, I will provide first a brief genealogy of Cuban folk Catholicism, which finds its earliest origin in the Spanish folk Christian practices, first arrived with the discoverers of the New World in late 15th century. Secondly, I will highlight relevant religious systems of African origin, emblematically Regla Ocha, like Santeria. Thirdly, I will discuss the Spiritismo, a Cuban iteration of the legacy of 19th century Frenchman Allan Kardec, and the spiritualist traditions of the 20th century United States of America.
Isn't it interesting that Spiritismo and Allan Kardec both came up in this work?
Yeah.
Because those are two things that I've mentioned before. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
Yep. I want to do another video on Alan Carlick. I've been meant to do that for months now. I would do some more reading on him. The study of the contents of these religious systems sheds light on why and how some of the elements commonly found in Cuban folk religion came to be so. This study alone, however, could not claim to engage the whole ethnological or even theological import of the actuality of these Cuban family religions. To ground either analysis of folk religion solely on the contents of these systems would risk the adoption of verificationist strategies with corresponding disruption in content and methodology to follow. Hence, these descriptions will be organized around historical examples illustrating the syncretic dynamics at work, the mutual borrowing that have taken place between these religious systems and the wider Cuban culture at specific points in Cuban history. Specifically, I will also emphasize these secret dynamics contesting opposed religious systems and discourses with hermeneutical creativity which engenders ritual subversion. While archaeological and ethnographic studies have revealed many details of the religions of the pre-Columbian Aboriginal peoples of Cuba, there is only so much current material evidence of their enduring presence within the Cuban religious spirit norm. More relevant to my argument, however, is the discerned patterns of cultural exchange, the multiple and multi-layered cultural give and take. What's up, cousin? Give and take between different ethnic groups populating the Antilles. The ancient history of the Caribbean begins with early inhabitants consisting of hunting-gathering groups, probably from multiple origins. Later groups with South America with ceramic and horticulture skills began to migrate to the Lesser Antilles and Puerto Rico, possibly interacting biologically, socially, and culturally with the previous archaic population. Although it is poorly understood, this interaction was probably intense and continues, leading eventually to a process of creolization and an increase in cultural diversity throughout the Caribbean archipelago. Whatever the heck that means. Group of islands. Okay. I don't know why they use that big ass words. Group of islands. Anyway. And even within single islands, many of these processes and cultural characteristics were also presented in the late pre-Columbian time. Although Columbus touched on Cuban shores as early as October 28, 1492, it was not until 1511 that Diego Velázquez, commissioned by Christopher's brother Diego Columbus, began in earnest the Spanish archipelago. At this point, the native populations there had endured almost 2 decades of colonial presence, and at a high price. European illnesses, from some of which these natives had no adequate genetic or clinical responses, as well as subhuman treatment at the hands of the conquerors, along with self-immolation, something that decimated the Cuban native population, almost to the point of demographic disappearance. To this day, there are persistent assertions, even within scholarly circles and general historical literature, that the Cuban native population had effectively been wiped out by the end of the Conquista period. Now, that, I'm going to finish the paragraph. There remain, however, identifiable, quantitatively significant native communities which went on to coexist and completely integrate with Cuban black and white Creoles, eventually to remain mostly in rural areas and eventually giving away to the Guajiro culture. I have read that too, that saying that like the Taino people of those islands and stuff are completely wiped out, and that like they're all living through the black and white, like the black Africans and the Europeans that came there. And it says too, almost like like the, what would you call it? The Afrocentric type era, when all the Afrocentric stuff started popping up in the Americas to give black people some type of identity and stuff like that after the Civil Rights Movement. That was a movement in Puerto Rico, pretty much recognizing the Taino or Rican, whatever we call it, presence, saying that they are still a pure people, that those people actually still exist, that they're not extinct. From what I read, there's really no evidence behind it. But most people would say that the people, not the culture, but like the people themselves, no longer exist. Whether you really are true or not, I don't know.
The thing is, they pretty much did wipe them out, but they mixed them up with the other peoples of those countries where they were found. They're even found in Haiti.
Yeah.
So it's really weird, but it's unfortunate. But yeah, like that's it. It's just a sad story how that went, but
Yeah, there's history. A lot of people out there that claim like, oh, I'm 100% Taino. I'm like, dude.
yeah. Like, sadly, that's not the case. Even though they might want to hold on to some Taino customs, that ain't the case.
Right. It says the first religious tradition that present in Cuba, then present in Cuba, and which still persists, is a discernible hold is Roman Catholicism, brought by the Spanish colonizers beginning in the late 15th century. They form a religious narrative, ritual, and worldview were, and on one hand, essentially consistent with the institutional versions of Christianity of the time, and on the other, merged with culturally embedded religious perceptions and practices. If the European commercial enterprise of discovery and colonization was firmly rooted in the early modern spirit that would precede the Renaissance, the Roman Catholicism brought to the Americas was medieval throughout. It was filled with local canons of narrative and ritual, mythical recreations of the traditions fostered by Christian churches, and plain deviations from even the most generous Christian orthodoxy of the time. Among these, it is worth emphasizing the widespread system in place for the devotion to saints and other supernatural beings, coupled with sophisticated understanding of the cult of relics and of their place within the economy of salvation as expounded by Christian churches. However, and perhaps more importantly, this was a form of Christianity which had just undergone the Reconquista years and now found itself at the end of nearly a millennium of the Al-Andalus domination of the Iberian Peninsula, marking thus a significant point in the ongoing and otherwise unavoidable fusion between the Iberian and the Al-Andalus cultures of the time. As a consequence, the forms of folk Catholicism brought to the Americas by both missionaries and colonizers were neither impervious to external religious and cultural influence, nor devoid of strategies for actively engaging in culture and religious syncretism. However, the experiences of the Reconquista also provided the triumphant Spaniards with very dysfunctional cultural instincts, out of which the colonizers, more often than not, engaged the people they found in the New World.
Can I just say something real quick? The word that you just mispronounced, unfortunately, is Reconquista. and
Yeah.
I can get into what that is real briefly. There
All
was a
right.
time when Spain was under Islamic rule. It was a long time. It was 800 years.
Okay.
So they finally were able to get the country back, and they made it from an Islamic country to a Catholic Christian country. So that was the Reconquista. And the
Oh,
reason it was such a big deal is because they had suffered in their minds under the yoke of the Islamic rule for so long that they were basically, when they got, that off of them, that really was a big deal. Like they felt free at that point. They could
right.
finally practice Roman Catholicism the way they wanted to. So they really went hard for it. So
So this is like the time with like when people was talking about the Moors and stuff ruled Spain, and
yeah,
when
the Moors were one of the different Islamic groups that were controlling Spain, and they did a lot of good, but sometimes the people play up the good they did. But yeah, that's the Reconquista. That's the context of the Reconquista.
yeah, because I read that when they got them out of there, they just went buck wild. It was like, man, the hell up out of here.
Yeah.
That was better go far away from there.
Because they really didn't like being under Islamic rule because they made certain rules for the Catholics that they had to follow, and people hate following rules.
Right.
But yeah, that's it. I just wanted to give that some context.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Said the people they found in the New World, the other was to be feared, deceived, submitted, and whenever possible, made into subject of profitable contest. Cuban native populations lasted little more than half a century after arrival of 1492, before their destruction as cultures and people, and eventually near disappearance from the Cuban ethnographic pyramid. Likely as a consequence of this phenomenon, there is very little evidence of any colonial borrowings from the Cuban native culture and religions, except for geographical names, gastronomic traditions, and very specific linguistic terms. This fast-paced disappearance of Cuban indigenous people also meant that colonial enterprise would have to find slave labor force elsewhere. The argument for resorting to enslaved Africans instead were so persuasive then that even Fray Bartolome de las Casas, otherwise a zealous protector of original people.
I know who that guy is. That's Bartolome de las Casas. He was one of the leading people condemning the Spanish. I read his book about the conquest of the Americas, and he had nothing good to say about the conquistadores because in his mind those were some of the wickedest sons of Satan that ever lived, and it's a crazy book. But yeah, that guy was really he loved the natives and he hated the people. He was a Spaniard himself, but he hated Spaniards.
Right. So I guess
he saw so much evil from Spaniards.
Wow. So he was pretty much like a what you call like in the Americas like a what do you call it? Shit, I can't think of the word. What do you call it?
I mean, the guy blew the whistle. The guy blew the whistle on some of the atrocities committed by the Spaniards, and he tried to wake up all of Spain because he believed that he had a moral duty to do so.
Right.
He thought that God would judge Spain for what they had done. So.
Yeah, because this is the part that I found like I liked a lot. Most of what I was reading in this like last minute, I was like, wow, I gotta look up like influence and stuff. So that's dope that you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just had to mention that.
So that the African slave trade into the Americas, and specifically Cuba, also brought about multi-layered, persistent cultural exchanges between the cultures and even religions of Spanish colonizers and enslaved Africans. These exchanges first took place and saw their main dynamics tested and developed shortly after the onset of the slave trade. When the populations of enslaved Africans in Cuba had not reached the peak they would during the sugar bonanza of the first half of the 19th century. Some of these exchanges, however, occurred under rather unexpected circumstances. For example, in the case of the Cuban Cabildos de Nación, you know what I mean? I don't.
I've heard of it before, but Nación is obviously nation, but I could look up Cabildos. I just don't remember that.
Okay. And it says, or associations for mutual help for enslaved Africans, each integrated by members of one specific ethnic group, which began to appear by the end of the 1570s.
I just thought of something, actually. The funny thing is they used to form these groups called cofradías or confraternities. And what they used to do is they would be outwardly Catholic, but they would have different, they would be like Santero type things.
Yeah.
Like societies. So this was also in Brazil. If you read about Brazil, they also had those.
It says, end of the 15th, Africans each integrated by members of one specific ethnic group, which began to appear by the end of the 1570s, duly tolerated, even encouraged by the Spanish authorities. This colonial strategy may have been at least partly determined by the fact that slave owners were mandated by law to baptize and educate the enslaved Africans in the Roman Catholic Christian faith. Cuban Cabildos, I can't even pronounce that, were essentially modeled after the confraternities, which you were just talking about, or the confraternities found in Seville since the 14th century. And both were organized around the devotion to specific Christian saints within the Western Roman Catholic tradition. Just as the confraternities from Seville, Cuban Cabildos, let me see how you pronounce it. So I know I'm probably pronouncing it wrong.
It's kind of funny. I took 4 or 5 years of Spanish, and I did a whole lot of work on it on my own, but I still need to work on it. So,
yeah, I never took no Spanish, never in school or nothing.
Well, it was probably the one class that I cared about. And I was smart, but I didn't really like school, so that was a real big thing for me.
Show them the damn thing. Okay, well, I'll get that later. Whatever. And all y'all Spanish people, y'all know what it says. What it says. Retain a remarkable degree of autonomy, and while originally meant to serve as a form of controlling the cultural penetration of the African slave population in Cuba, Cabildos soon became extraordinary reserves of cultural wealth, language, religion, and overall a safe space for enslaved Africans to affirm their identities and in the process contest and subvert the regime of power responsible for the loss of physical freedom and uprooting from their respective lands of origin. Cabildos, I gotta learn how to pronounce that.
Cabildos.
Also provided public, legally sanctioned spaces for some of the most festive and ritually powerful elements of the cultures and religions of enslaved Africa, thus helping to preserve, nurture, and pass down the cultural heritage to their descendants, and eventually bled into the wider Cuban culture. They constituted a public and evolving platform for enslaved Africans, borrowing from multiple elements of the Spanish culture and forms of religious belief and practice. One of the most public privileges enjoyed by the Cabildos involved the right to host festivities, and even reasonably spectacular processions, as long as these coincided with important feasts on the calendar of the Roman Catholic Church, and most emblematically that of the Christian saint naming each individual Cabildo. So they was allowing them to do their thing, long as, like I said, coincided with the important feasts on the calendar of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, you have to keep in mind though that when they were allowing this, they kind of looked at it kind of funny. They kind of saw it as strange. Our name for it, the name that we call it commonly Santeria, comes from a mocking nickname they gave it. So the original name for Santeria is Regla de Ocha or Lukumi. Have you ever heard of Lukumi?
Yes.
So Santeria is a derisive nickname, so that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
They're mocking view of the saints' adherence to, Los Santos.
Okay. It is perhaps at this point that enslaved Africans in Cuba further developed hermeneutical methodologies which have been categorized under the principle of multiple representation, proposed by Cuban ethnographer James Figueroa. It originally referred to the exception of the Orishas in its totality, whether it is external manifestation or its main narrative patterns and objective embodiment. This principle decides the hermeneutics devices adopted by populations of enslaved Africans in Cuba who accepted and appealed to Christian Roman Catholic narratives and symbols in order to publicly identify their own ethically distinctive religious discourses and rituals. They eventually adopted cosmologies in which narratives, rituals, and supernatural beings originating in both their own religious traditions and in the Roman Catholicism of their white owners were culturally and narratively collapsed into one distinct ritual, symbol, or supernatural being, while its external features deemed acceptable by the established religious authorities. The resulting symbolic religious devices also conceal deeply dialogically invested extensions into beliefs and practices originating in their own African context, which in fact contested the essence of those same authorities. Multiple representation referred to and describes the process of cultural translation, for example, accomplished by the fusion and convergence of hagiographies of Christian saints, writing of the lives of saints, of Christian saints in Yoruba Patakis. What the heck does that mean? That means my computer don't even know that. Computer said, stop asking me. Or mythological narratives about the Orishas, as well as by the combined use of images, objects, and colors, which would signify either the Christian saint or the Yoruba Orisha, and thus create a dual appeal to otherwise competing narrative and ritual canons. The essential element to Lacatenaries principle of multiple representation still describe ongoing everyday events of religious practice in which Cuban religious practitioners discern and organize a polarity of distinct religious forms into more than less permanent systems of narrative ritual. This is certainly the case with Cuban family religions, and specifically with the practice of Bovedas, the spiritualities. For example, the practitioner identification and appeal to characters represented in the Boveda is usually elastic enough to switch at will from Regle Ocha to folk Catholicism canons, a statue or devotional printout depicting the Virgin de la Caridad, Roman Catholic patrons of Cuba, might also be identified by the practitioner as Oshun. Yoruba Orishas alleged to symbolize love and beauty and traditionally syncretized by practitioners of Cuban folk religions with Virgin de la Caridad. The regular Ocha or Santeria terms, most often used for describing the Lukumi religious cult of Yoruba origin, arrived in Cuba in the early times of African slavery in the country, and is the most extensively practiced in the African religious system in Cuba. The meaning of the term varies depending on the work, author, and historical period involved. La Cadere, with obvious enthusiasm, describes it as the religious system of Afro-Cubans. Rafael Lopez describes Santeria as, generally speaking, made up of two great interrelated liturgical sectors and so-called Regla de Ocha, and that relative to the oracle of Ifa, hence is being appealed to as the religious complex of Ocha Ifa, according to Alberto Cute. Regla de Ocha establishes the cult of the Orishas and entails the affirmations of one supreme, uncreated divinity, Laura the Mary, which at the same time gives origin to the numerous Orishas, with which it is not possible to communicate directly. But through the Orishas, roads of all the Mary, which is like the chief deity, I believe, in like the Yoruba religion. That's like the I guess the head deity that born all the other Orishas.
Yeah, I think I've heard of something like that. Is his name Olodumare?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, all right, cool.
Like the main, like the creator, like the creator God. And all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the one that gets represented by Jesus in many altars. Yeah, I've seen that.
Okay, the central purpose of Yoruba religion is to worship Orishas, created by Olomare, to the end of making known in creation his will and essence. Orishas are anthropomorphic personifications of the Ashe, that is, the blood of the life of the cosmos. The power of Ordinary for life, strength, and justice, as well as mythical guides and protectors of humankind. It is from Ordinary that everything proceeds and everything returns to him. He expresses himself in the created world through the strength of Ashe. To the strength of Ashe, the absolute ground of reality. Yoruba religion also entails a strong narrative and ritual elaboration around ancestors. It is possible to take a twin approach, linguistic and conceptual, and the consulted sources. On the one hand, there are Egun, ancestors of each family who are venerated in their own altars. It also extends to the local community and more generally to the spirits of the dead. On the other hand, there are Ikuis, that's how you pronounce that, or the dead, who are revered and cared for like the Orishas, as they are believed to either protect or bring about misfortune to human beings. Although it is common to see the term Egun and Aku used indistinctly to refer to the dead. What becomes apparent in an ancestral hierarchical dynamic in which memorable individuals of the family or religiously defined cross-family group or honored as Egun, ancestors in a precarious hierarchical balance with Orishas, many of whom evidence their origin in some legendary ancestor. And then the rest of the dead is Ekus or Los Muertos. Another perspective, particularly pertaining to my thesis, has been highlighted by Clara Ojo, or Ojo, whatever, I don't know how you pronounce it, concerning at least one worldview, which is possible to verify in Santeria, as symbolized by the Orun, or total universe of the material and spiritual existence, which asserts that divinities, Orishas, and ancestrales are all in the Orun. But Orun is not a place apart in the great beyond, but rather a space that is accessible to all in quotidian fashion, rounding up the edges of historical reality in which their interventions are sought out. Thus, the spatial relation between the living and the dead do not require the overcoming of any dualist frontier, but instead the participation from the full being in existence is symbolized by a pumpkin, in which two halves are actually complementary rather than contradictory. Aye, a space of earthly life, manifesting this physical world, and a room, space of spiritual life of ancestors and origins. These discussions, however, are only confessional expositions of certain aspects of Aruba religion, as it evolved in Cuba. Any account of the secretive processes found in Cuba for religious practices and specifically related to family religions and Boveda and spiritualities must also consider the borrowing of Catholicism, and specifically folk Catholicism, as well as spiritualism. Most importantly, it should underscore the processes through which these borrowings have evolved and continue to evolve, especially those which have been referring to as of a secretive nature. Secretism as a cultural process is characterized by the ability of religious practitioners to reproduce their culture even in conditions of subordination and dependence. This is exemplified by the way Boveda astrologers and spiritualities were assumed as part of Santeria's practice, borrowed from the incipient spiritualist practice in Cuba. Spiritismo, a Cuban variation of the spiritualist. I'm not going to keep y'all too much longer, though. Experimental, y'all see why. A spiritismo, a Cuban variation of the spiritualist wave of the 19th and early 20th centuries, is in fact the religious tradition with the most influence on the practices of Cuban family religions. Evidence in the interviews conducted, also the most philosophically invested of these Cuban religious traditions. And Spiritismo has greatly contributed to overall Cuban cultural notions about death and the dead. In spiritualism, the categories of existence pre and post mortem are fluid and set within a complementary relation, making conceptual room for a very particular form of belief in reincarnation, understood as the only means of overcoming the imperfections of earthly life, so the dead might transform into an enlightened spirit. In this sense, a different from other religious expressions, death is interpreted as the way towards spiritual purification and perfection, rather than in terms of eternal, unchangeable post-mortem fate. Practitioners of spiritualism assert that after death, the soul does not dissolve, but rather the perispirit or astral body returns to its original state, the world of the spiritual, while preserving its individual and unique identity. It is within these conceptions that spiritualism affirms a belief in the possibility of communication between the worlds of the living and the dead, the earthly with the spiritual. In its most conventional form, this communication takes place through a medium. However, in most Cuban forms of spiritualism or Espiritismo, some of this communication is accomplished by means of the Bóveda Espiritual, an altar espiritista. After Spiritism was brought to Cuba from Europe towards the end of the 19th century, it spread first among the white Cuban Creoles, 18th and 19th century descendants of the colonial ethnic blend, who identified with it with modern liberal thinking, uncommitted to Spanish colonialism, in contrast to Roman Catholicism. Ideologically support of the metropolis and slavery as its economic foundation. But there were other ensuing links between slavery and Spiritism. Even before enslaved Africans began arriving on Cuban shores, having been forced to travel in the bottom of sail ships across the Atlantic in inhumane conditions, they had also been robbed of their freedom to fully act upon their cultural and religious identities. In the case of enslaved Yorubas, a loss with enduring consequences would be that of funeral priests, and the rituals only they were traditionally allowed to perform. Their funeral rituals, presided over by a very exclusive caste of priests, were carefully elaborated and informed by arcane, orally transmitted canons. In its original Yoruba form, a gungun, or the set of ritual objects and orders for the cult of the Igun, or legendary ancestors, were strictly limited to male ritual celibates, just as the cult of the Ayamis, or supernatural forces, or agents of disruption, was exclusively reserved for women. After having been forced to leave behind their rituals and objects, and upon their effective disappearance of their ancestral cults, many Yoruba and their descendants in the New World set themselves to find alternatives that would enable the ritual honoring of ancestors. Uprooted enslaved Africans, even as they approached the Americas, were already struggling with the full implications of these losses. As many of them died in the high seas because of illness, mistreatment, hunger, or even suicide, only for the slave masters to have thrown them overboard into the ocean by other surviving companions of misfortune, who were furthermore unable to provide what the cultural and social substance deemed to be the most elementary ritual attention for the dead. Enslaved Cubans in Cuba may have later constituted to one or another degree. Some of these traditions, however, there has never been a coherent, socially recognized, and culturally re-ingrained recovery of Yoruba ritual devices or traditions concerned with the dead or the dead. This may help to explain the borrowing that some enslaved Yorubas made from the not so orthodox religious practices of not a few of their white owners, specifically the Spiritismo. The rich, powerful ritual discourse of the spiritualist liturgies is philosophical provision for existential categories of continuity, return, and rebirth resonated very deeply with enslaved Africans and their descendants. When some Cuban Criollos hosted the equivalents of spiritualist seances in their homes, the most powerful practices of their traditions were eventually appropriated by the enslaved Africans serving the master's house. While analyzing secret processes involved in the confirmation of Cuban folk religion practices, I have largely concentrated on the agency of the enslaved Africans and their descendants. However, this implies no intentional disregard to the secret agency of other social actors, Spanish colonials, free slaves, and Creoles, who indeed participated actively from these secret processes, albeit in different capacities. My concern has been first to describe these processes in their earliest stages, and second to argue that even then, these secret processes came to be in context where submission was contested with hermeneutical creativity and narrative and ritual subversion. Also, and as I will argue next, drastic social and political changes on the last half of the 19th century in Cuba also contributed to both accelerate and diversify even further these sacred dynamics, eventually extending them into a wider ethically diverse spectrum of Cuban society of the time and culture as a whole. I think I'm going to stop. Oh, I got one more chapter.
Well, that was definitely an interesting thing to listen to. One thing I want to point out that I mentioned previous is that the Kardecian spiritualism, you know, that stuff, it actually developed, but what it came from is kind of silly. I think I mentioned this before, but it came from two sisters known as the Fox sisters.
Okay.
And they were making noises with their toes, and they managed to get the adults' attention that way, so they kept doing it, and then people made up things even after they said what they did. They basically admitted to it. So spiritualism got its start with those two.
Huh.
It really is. It really would blow you away if you knew the origin of a lot of these things. But yeah,
I'm gonna look that up. You said it's the Fox sisters.
Yeah, the Fox sisters. And like I said, they even admitted to the fraud.
Yeah, I'm gonna check that out. Yeah, I thought it was that Alan Kardec dude was like he was looking for a scientific approach to spirituality. That's as far as I got in my research.
You know, I wish that was the case, but unfortunately, he was trying to give backup to the idea that people could talk to ghosts or spirits. Right. I mean, people really wanted to believe that, but you got to look up the Fox sisters. It's a crazy story, along with fairy photographs. That's another thing that was big at the time. Taking photographs of fairies.
Oh, shit.
Which was fake, by the way, in case you didn't know, that got blown out the water too.
Okay, I got it. The Fox sisters. Fox sisters said from New York, who played an important role in the creation of spiritualism. Wow. Yeah, I can do another video on that.
And in fact, the cabin where they did most of their spirit communication, so to speak, was it's now a monument. There's like a thing next to it.
I'm going to read this one thing from it. It said, Margaret and Katie made very strong statements against spiritualism that have been chiefly instrumental in perpetrating a fraud of spiritualism upon two confiding public. Most of you doubtless know. The greatest sorrow in my life has been that this is true. And though it has come late in my day, I am now prepared to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. I am here tonight as one of the founders of spiritualism to denounce it as an absolute falsehood from beginning to end, as the flimsiest of superstition and most wicked blasphemy known to the world. Oh shit. Damn. Death Flow of Spiritualism by A.B. Davenport. Wow. Also see New York World. I regard spiritualism as one of the greatest curses that the world has ever known. Katie Fox, Jenkins. New York Herald, 1888. Well, hot damn.
Yeah. and you know what's so embarrassing about that? People took that idea and they started giving it sophistication, and then people forgot that they got it from 2 little girls making noises with their toes.
That's crazy. They sit there, they play with their toes and shit. They like, what's that?
And they would have long conversations with these spirits of the dead, so to speak. And the adults would just be like, wow.
Yep. Because I remember there was like a show, like a TV show back in the day, and they made fun of it. Like the people having seances, and the table will move. They'll have something all set up, so the table will shake and all types of stuff.
Oh yeah. Speaking of that, you know what's crazy? You know Harry Houdini?
Yeah. Yep.
At some point, he got tired of doing escape tricks and magic tricks, and he went after mediums. Like, he would go to medium shows, and he wouldn't let anyone know who he was. So he would go in there and ask them questions that the spirits would supposedly be able to answer.
Yeah.
And he would get different answers every time. I mean, he had a mother who didn't even speak English, but when the medium would channel the dead mother, she would be speaking perfect English. Like, she only spoke Yiddish because she was a Jewish immigrant.
Yeah.
And that was just the funniest thing, because he would instantly know that the person was lying through their teeth.
Huh.
And he made it his life work towards at the end to show that all these mediums were playing tricks on people. In some cases, it was pretty bad because the medium would be doing all kinds of weird stuff.
Wow. That's deep, yo.
Yeah, it is. But this whole topic is deep.
It's amazing how people are still, because I know a friend of mine, father, was telling me about he grew up in that, like the spiritism.
As a religion, there is a thing called the Spiritualist Church, and they exist all over the world. But yeah, it's insane.
They said they would go to a person's house, like, right, and say like somebody's sick or something, right? They will go to the house, and all the people that were down in the thing, they will all go there, and they would hold hands and stuff, right? And then I think they would start singing or doing something, like the head of the thing would do the seance or whatever, and somebody will just start blurting out shit, just and they would tell like who's sick, and they would say who did it, right? And they would say like the person would, whoever they said it was, somebody in the building that lives in their apartment building or something, would get sick afterwards, or something would happen to him or something. They would know that he's the person that put that thing on that person that gets sick, like put a spell on them or whatever, or something like that.
Yeah. This gets into a lot of superstitious stuff, and I'm gonna hold off somewhat. But yeah, it's crazy stuff.
Yeah, that's crazy.
But yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure to come on. I'll see you next time. Take care.
Yeah, thanks a lot for coming on with me, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, shalom, amigo.
Yep. Shalom, amigo.
Since I'm speaking so much Spanish today, I thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah, you throw that up in there.
Shalom, hermano.
Yep. Secretism up there. Secretism up. Yep. All right, that was Becky Speakfield, man. Thanks, Becky Speakfield, for coming on. Thank you, P, for holding down the chat. What's up? We had too many knuckleheads up here. I thought I got rid of this motherfucker. Don't know how to come in here and act like you mean. So it's all with bullshit. Once again, thank you all for tuning in. Nick Springfield, Marcus D, Mighty Soccer Count, Troll, Malak, Yakshizakwa, I don't know the goddamn Hebrew names and shit. Cousin Kafu is Kafuwa. Thank you definitely for coming in, cousin. I gotta get you on here one day. I gotta get you on here. We talk about power. So, yup. He says, Hope everyone heard something interesting. Add to your archive of knowledge tonight. I gotta find the name of the thing. I get the PDF for you guys, so you guys can read the whole thing. This is pretty damn big. So Fox Systems. I gotta Fox Systems. You gotta find a link for this darn thing here. This is it. Bring you right to it. Yep, sure enough does. All right. You guys get some extra, you know what I'm saying? Y'all get to leave with something. How many YouTube channels you get to leave with something? Right? How many channels y'all leave with something? Y'all get something for free to hold on to. So here's the link to the thesis and stuff I just read from, so you guys can read the whole thing. I got a couple other writings, like videos that I did on Apollo and Cuba and stuff. I got to put up those links too for you guys. There was super long videos, some are like 2 or 3 parts. So I got to find out. I want to do it again, but I don't want to listen to them again and shit, and then try to find out what I didn't read out of it, and like finish it up, and then give y'all the link and stuff. So I don't know, y'all got this one this time, though. So I got this. How many people were watching? Probably wasn't too many people, but it's all good. But these type of videos get a lot of views on my channel. Like a lot of people, they're not like a lot of views, but like they're constantly watching these videos. Like especially the Apollo videos and stuff like that. People are constantly watching these videos. So, I'm trying to like transform my channel to do more stuff like this, rather than the other stuff that I'm usually known for and shit. Burning up the old West Union Ave and shit. So he almost out of here. Ain't even got to worry about his ass. But yeah. So you guys get to leave with something and see what else you said. Yeah, we only had one person active food. Mark D was the one that was active. Yup, he said it not be the screen. Yeah, so thanks again, y'all. Make sure y'all hit that goddamn like button. And I'm gonna put that link in the comment boards too, so you guys can. So that head on out of here. I don't know what. Find another song. Said girls playing with their toes. God damn. Playing with their damn toes. Yeah, let's go with this one.
Agua tiene un nido y un pájaro del agua. El agua tiene un nido. Ay, anda muerto de la sed, viento del agua nacido. Anda muerto de la sed, viento del agua nacido. Tiene agua de beber, viento del agua nacido. Voy tinyo, a la web, papá tinyo, a la web, voy tinyo, a la web, digo tinyo, a la web. Ay, sana, sana, tita, papá tinyo, a la web, con la una y son la papá tinyo, a la web. Ay, ¿dónde está papá tinyo? Papá tinyo, a la web, lo llama papá cangelo, papá tinyo, a la web. Ay, lo llama papá bello, papá tinyo, a la web. Ay, sana, sana, tita, papá tinyo, a la web. Hay un mite los demos, papá tinyo, a la web, tinyo, a la web, papá tinyo, a la web, tinyo, a la web, llegó tinyo, a la web, tinyo, a la web, papá tinyo, a la web, tinyo, a la web, llegó tinyo, a la web, tinyo, a la web, papá tinyo, a la web, ay, tana, tana, tita, papá tinyo, a la web, sola, una y sola, papá tinyo, a la web, ay, ¿dónde está papá tinyo? Papá tinyo, a la web, lo llama papá candela. Ay, lo llamo, lo quiero. Patillo, patillo, patillo,
All right, y'all. Y'all have a good night. Peace.